I'm Alexis Harrington, and welcome to Everyone's Gay, A Look into Queer History, episode 21, the last one of season 1. I chose this episode to be the last because the story represents a personal significance. So I want to start by telling you a personal story. 2017, the miniseries When We Rise came out, which is based on a memoir of the same name by Cleve Jones. I had just come out the year before and didn't know much about queer history, other than what was covered in my AP US History class. This miniseries focused on 3 activists: Ken Jones, an African-American veteran who fought for LGBTQ+ equality and against racism; Roma Guy, a lesbian feminist badass; and Cleve Jones. After watching this miniseries, which I recommend very much, by the way, I wanted to learn more. So I picked up a copy of the book, When We Rise, and soon it became one of my favorites, as it ignited my desire to learn more about queer history and all the moments of the movements that got us where we are today. It also inspired me to create my own activism, in a way. Since then, I have read several memoirs, books, watched movies and documentaries, taken queer history classes, shout out to Professor Connolly, and I strongly believe that none of that would have happened to the extent that it did without Cleve Jones. Today, we are focusing on Cleve Jones and his life of activist work. He is a personal hero of mine, and it is only fitting that we end season 1 with an episode all on him. So let's get started. I'm Alexis Harrington, and welcome to Everyone's Gay, A Look into Queer History. Cleve Jones was born in West Lafayette, Indiana, but moved with his family to Scottsdale, Arizona when he was 14. His father was a psychologist, and his mother was a Quaker, which actually benefited Cleve during the draft for the Vietnam War. Growing up, Cleve Jones was an active member of the anti-war movement in the Phoenix area, although he never really accepted Phoenix as his home. When he was 15, he planned to kill himself because he thought he was the only gay kid in the world, and he didn't want to live that way, alone. He didn't want to be ashamed or beaten up, but then something caught his eye. It was an article in a magazine. It was in Life magazine, and it told about the gay liberation movement and of what happened at Stonewall in New York City and what was going on in San Francisco at the time. So he decided that he wasn't going to kill himself. And when he was 18, he came out to his parents. Due to his father's profession and the belief that homosexuality was a mental illness, he waited until he was 18 so that he would not be forced to participate in electroshock therapy or any other damaging therapies. So Cleve left Arizona and he headed up to San Francisco, the gay mecca at the time. And there, Cleve Jones met Harvey Milk, and the two became close friends. Jones would later reflect on Milk as a father figure, and as the man that saved his life, as Milk was one of the first people to tell Cleve Jones that he had value as a human being and didn't need to change. Harvey provided him an internship on the condition that Jones enrolled at the San Francisco State University. He enrolled first in the film school, but soon switched to political science so he could get credit for his internship at City Hall. On November 27, 1978, Cleve Jones got to work a little early, but then realized he had left a really important file back at his apartment. So Harvey sent him home to retrieve the file. As he was leaving his apartment, he heard someone shout that the mayor had been shot. Flagging down his taxi, Jones rushed back to City Hall. When he reached it, he saw police swarming around the mayor's office. He ran up the stairs as the Board of Supervisors' offices were located on the 2nd floor. And he began to panic when he saw Dianne Feinstein running past him, with blood on her sleeves and on her hands. It is then that Cleve Jones recounts he looked down the hallway and saw Harvey's feet sticking out of Dan White's office. To learn more about Harvey Milk and his murder, check out our last episode that focuses on it. You can click this banner above. It was this moment that forced Cleve Jones into natural leadership. As 6 months later, when it was announced that Dan White would only receive a 7-year sentence for the murder of Harvey Milk and George Moscone, Jones took Harvey's megaphone and spoke to a crowd of 500 gatherers on Castro Street, beginning the peaceful march that would eventually turn into one of the most violent uprisings in queer history. In 1981, Jones went to work in the district office of State Assemblyman Art Agnos, but began noticing that some of his friends in the Castro were beginning to fall ill from an unknown disease. He began using his position in the community to spread awareness, and in 1982, when AIDS was still a new and largely underestimated threat, Jones co-founded what is now known as the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. Founded as a nonprofit dedicated to providing services for people with HIV and AIDS. The San Francisco AIDS Foundation is one of the largest and oldest community-based AIDS service organizations in the United States. And in 1985, Jones and other members of the community held the annual candlelight vigil to honor Harvey Milk. He had Harvey's old bullhorn in one hand and a stack of poster board and markers in the other. He began passing them out, asking people to write the name of someone they knew who had been killed by the new disease. At first, people were ashamed to do it, due to the stigma imposed on the disease and the community. But finally, they began writing the names, the first and last names, of people they had lost, people they had loved. They began carrying those names with candles, and they marched all the way to the building that housed the Health and Human Services West Coast offices for the federal government under the Reagan administration. Earlier that day, Jones and his friends had hidden ladders in the shrubbery nearby and climbed up the front stone, grabbing the posters and taping them to the wall. After getting off the ladder, Jones walked into the crowd, seeing thousands of people reading the names on the placards up on the wall. As Jones looked up at the names, he had a thought. It looked like an enormous patchwork quilt, and that inspired him. In 1987, he created the first quilt panel in honor of his friend Marvin Feldman, and this officially began the AIDS Memorial Quilt. The Names Project officially started in 1987 in San Francisco by Jones, Mike Smith, and a number of other volunteers. At the time, many people who died from AIDS did not receive funerals, due in part to the stigma surrounding AIDS felt by the surviving family members, and also the outright refusal of many funeral homes and cemeteries to handle the deceased remains. Without a memorial service or a gravesite, people turned to the quilt as an opportunity for survivors to remember those they had lost.
Young, Steve Head, Michael, Robert H. Wilson, Jerry.
In 1987, the first showing of the quilt was brought to the National Mall in Washington, D.C. It was displayed every year after until 1996.
James Martin Case, Paul Castro, Bill Cathcart, Bob Greenwood, Felix Velarde Munoz.
As they unraveled the quilt on the National Mall, the volunteers read out the names of those who had been lost.
Gary Walsh.
And every year it was ignored by those it was supposed to gain the attention of, specifically the president. The quilt was last displayed in full on the mall in 1996. And finally, it wasn't ignored, as President Bill Clinton and First Lady Hillary Clinton visited the quilt, reading the names one by one on the panels.
Marion Besco.
The quilt is a memorial to and a celebration of the lives lost to the AIDS pandemic, which marks it as a prominent forerunner of the 20th century shift towards celebrating victims and survivors rather than stigmatizing them.
Mark S. Bowles.
Ricky M.R.J., Tom McDaniel, Alfred B., Mike A., Anthony J., and my good friends, Father Robert Arpin and Father Jeremiah Burmeister.
My son and good friend, Gary Ebert.
Each panel is 3 feet by 6 feet,
Stuart John
approximately
Griffin,
the size of the average grave,
Robert Nance,
furthering the connection of
Michael
AIDS and death
Clark,
in the minds of those who see the quilt.
Little Eddie Coombs,
Keia Correa, Russell Dean Kuhn.
Sam,
Today, pieces of the AIDS Memorial Quilt are scattered around the country, with the majority of it being held in a warehouse in Atlanta when not being on display. It continues to grow, with it currently consisting of more than 48,000 individual memorial panels and weighing an estimated 54 tons. By the fall of 1985, almost everyone Jones knew was dead or dying or caring for someone who was dying of AIDS. He tested positive the week that the test came out after volunteering for a study. The study had blood samples going all the way back to 1977. So it was confirmed that Jones not only had HIV, but had the disease since the 1970s. He didn't expect to survive. And he almost didn't. As in 1993, he got very sick. His immune system collapsed, and he was allergic to many of the drugs used to treat the infection. So he moved out into the woods, in the redwood forest north of San Francisco, and prepared to spend the last days of his life there. But his doctor got him on one of the first studies that combined many medicines. This particular study, named the Cocktail, combined 3 drugs, and he responded almost immediately. He began that treatment in November of 1994, and today he still uses his voice, his experience, and his platform to advocate for the LGBTQ+ community and those living with HIV/AIDS. Cleve Jones has had a huge impact on the queer rights movement, and has a lasting memory in queer history. Picking up where Harvey Milk left off, Cleve Jones helped guide many young activists into the queer liberation movement, and held their hands when everyone they knew was dying of AIDS. Personally, I believe that I would not be doing this web series if it were not for the work of Cleve Jones and his inspiring activism. He inspired me to begin learning about queer history, and I am forever grateful for his work, his life, and the story he wrote down in his memoir, When We Rise. Speaking of which, to learn more about Cleve Jones, read his book, When We Rise, A Life in the Movement. Or if you're not a reader, check out the mini-series based on the book. Or do both. Links to both are in the description below. Additionally, he has many great interviews out there. One of my favorites is from the podcast LGBTQ&A, in which Jones talks about the movement, from Harvey Milk to AIDS, marriage equality, and the importance of community building. Lastly, I urge you to follow him on Facebook. Since the COVID-19 pandemic hit, he has been doing Facebook Live videos and offering words of wisdom when facing the pandemic. I also recommend you watch his video that was published on Harvey Milk's birthday, and he talks all about their relationship, and it is very moving and very powerful. He also frequently posts, so just follow him. I recommend it. I'm Alexis Arrington, and this has been Everyone's Gay, A Look into Queer History. Today's episode marks the end of our season, and if you like this episode and the entire season, make sure to hit subscribe, like, and share with your friends. We'll be back in a few months with Season 2, so make sure to follow us on social media to get all the updates. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Everyone's Gay Queer History. Also, just because the season's over doesn't mean we should stop learning about queer history, and I'll keep posting stories on those platforms. And in the meantime, you can also send us a Facebook message with a suggestion for a video for next season. I'll be sure to work in as much as I can. Again, I'm Alexis Arrington, and this has been Season 1 of Everyone's Gay, A Look into Queer History. I've had so much fun starting this series, and I want to thank you for coming along for the journey. I also want to thank you for all your constant support and viewership, so thank you. We'll see you next time.